Hello and welcome to the next video on social psychology. Today we're going to talk about conformity and the bystander effect, attributions and bias, cognitive dissonance, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Today you will learn about the bystander effect, what are attributions and how do they impact behavior, what is bias and how can we counter bias in our communications and relationships, and what impacts do stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination have in our society, and how can we better understand and navigate these issues. Conformity and obedience, how social influence creates social norms. When we decide on what courses to enroll in by asking for advice from our friends, change our beliefs or behaviors as a result of the ideas that we hear from others, or binge drink because our friends are doing it, we are engaging in conformity, a change in beliefs or behavior that occurs as the result of the presence of other people around us. We conform not only because we believe that other people have accurate information and we want to have knowledge, informational conformity, but also because we want to be liked by others, normative conformity. So the typical outcome of conformity is that our beliefs and behaviors become more similar to those around us. But some situations can create more conformity than others, and some of the factors that contribute to conformity are shown in the table, variables that increase conformity. In this table, you can see that if the number in the majority is bigger, so as the number of people who are engaging in a behavior increases, the tendency to conform to those people also increases. An example would be people stopping and looking up in the air when more than one or two people are looking up in the air. If everyone's looking, people are much more likely to look up. Unanimity. Conformity reduces sharply when any one person deviates from the norm. In the line study that we looked at in the previous lecture, we saw that when any one person gave a different answer, the conformity was kind of ruined. People were willing to go along with it as long as one person disagreed with the group besides them. Status and authority. People who have higher status, such as those in authority, do create more conformity. An example of this was the Milgram study, where they found that conformity during that obedience study was greatly reduced when the person giving the command to shock was described as an ordinary person, rather than a scientist at Yale University. Do we always conform? The research that we've talked about to this point suggests that most people conform to the opinions and desires of others, but it is not always the case that we blindly conform. For one, there are individual differences in conformity. People with lower self-esteem are more likely to conform than those with higher self-esteem. And people who are dependent on and who have a strong need for approval from others are more likely to conform. People who highly identify with or who have a high degree of commitment to a group are also more likely to conform to group norms than those who care less about the group. Despite these individual differences among people in terms of their tendency to conform, however, research has generally found the impact of individual differences, that variable on conformity, is smaller than the influence of situational variables, so the number and the unanimity of the majority. We have seen that conformity usually occurs such that the opinions and behaviors of individuals become more similar to the opinions and behaviors of the majority of the people in the group. However, and although it is much more unusual, there are cases in which a smaller group of individuals is able to influence the opinions or behaviors of the larger group. This is a phenomenon known as minority influence. Minorities who are consistent and confident in their opinions may in some cases be able to be persuasive. Persuasion that comes from minorities has another and potentially even more important effect on the opinions of majority group members. It can lead majorities to engage in fuller as well as more divergent, innovative, and creative thinking about the topics being discussed. Researchers found that participants working together in groups solved problems more creatively when at least one person gave a different and unusual response than the other numbers did, in comparison to when 3 or 4 people gave the same unusual response. It's a good thing that minorities can be influential. Otherwise, the world would be pretty boring. When we look back on history, we find that it is the unusual, divergent, innovative minority groups or individuals who, although frequently ridiculed at the time for their unusual ideas, end up being respected for producing positive change. Another case where conformity does not occur is when people feel that their freedom is being threatened by influence attempts, so they can resist that persuasion. In these cases, they may develop a strong emotional reaction that leads people to resist pressures to conform, known as psychological reactance. Reactance is aroused when our ability to choose which behaviors to engage in is eliminated or threatened with elimination. The outcome of the experience of reactance is that people may not conform at all. In fact, they may move their opinions or behaviors away from the desires of the influencer. Consider an experiment by Pennebaker and Sanders, who attempted to get people to stop writing graffiti on the walls of campus restrooms. In the first group of restrooms, they put a sign that read, "Do not write on these walls under any circumstances." Whereas in the second group, they placed a sign that simply said, "Please don't write on these walls." 2 weeks later, the researchers returned to the restrooms to see if the signs had made a difference. They found that there was significantly less graffiti in the second group of restrooms than in the first one. It seems as if people who were given strong pressures not to engage in the behavior were more likely to react against those directives than people who were given a weaker message. Reactance represents a desire to restore freedom that is being threatened. A child who feels that his or her parents are forcing them to eat their asparagus might react quite vehemently with a strong refusal to touch the plate. An adult who feels that she is being pressured by a car salesman might feel the same way and leave the showroom entirely, resulting in the opposite of the salesman's intended outcome. How the presence of others can reduce helping. We're going to talk about the case of Kitty Genovese. And in this case, basically, bystander intervention may have prevented the tragedy that happened on this evening. We'll talk about more research on this topic in a minute. So late in March in 1964, late at night, 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was murdered within a few yards of her apartment building in New York City after a violent fight with her killer in which she struggled and screamed. When the police interviewed Kitty's neighbors about the crime, they discovered that about 38 of the neighbors indicated they had seen or heard the fighting occurring, but none of them have bothered to intervene, and only one person had called the police. Was she murdered because there were too many people who heard her cries? Please watch the following video, and it will go over kind of that case and also give another example of bystander intervention. One note about the Kitty Genovese situation. More recent research has showed that perhaps the large number of people not calling was slightly inflated. However, there were witnesses that did hear enough that should have merited phone calls that did not. So keep that in mind. Two social psychologists, Latane and Darley, were interested in the factors that influence people to help or to not help in these situations. They developed a model that took into consideration the important role of the social situation in determining helping. This model has been extensively tested in many studies, and there is substantial support for it. Social psychologists have discovered that the people who don't call are also contributing to the tragedy because people are less likely to notice, interpret, and respond to the needs of others when they are with others than when they are alone. This model of helping is based on the idea that a variety of situational factors can influence whether or not we decide to help. Here's a graphic showing this model. It starts with the emergency, noticing the event, interpreting the event as an emergency, assuming responsibility, knowing how to give assistance, and then providing help. The first step in the model is noticing the event. The important role of the social situation in noticing, they ask participants to complete a questionnaire in a small room. Some of the participants completed the questionnaire alone, where others completed the questionnaire in small groups, in which 2 other participants were also working on the same questionnaire. A few minutes after the participants began, the experimenters started to let some white smoke come through the room through a vent in the wall. The experimenters timed how long it took before the first person in the room looked up and noticed the smoke. The people who were working alone noticed the smoke in about 5 seconds, and within 4 minutes, most of the participants who were working alone had taken some action. On the other hand, on average, the first person in the group conditions did not notice the smoke until 20 seconds had passed. Although 75% of participants who were working alone reported the smoke within 4 minutes, the smoke was reported in only 12% of the groups by that time. In fact, only 3 of the 8 groups did anyone report the smoke, even after it had filled the room. You can see that the social situation has a powerful influence on noticing. We simply don't see emergencies when other people are with us. Even if we notice an emergency, we might not interpret it as one. Were the cries of Kitty Genovese really calls for help, or did people think they were just maybe someone was arguing with a boyfriend? The problem is compounded when other people are around, because when we're unsure how to interpret events, we normally look to others to help us understand them, and at the same time they're looking to us for information. The problem is that each bystander thinks the other people aren't acting because they don't see an emergency. Believing that the others know something that they don't, each observer concludes that help is not required. Even if we have noticed the emergency and interpreted it as being one, this doesn't always mean that we will come to the rescue of other people. We still need to decide that it's our responsibility to do something. The problem is that when we see others around, it's easy to assume that they are going to do something and that we don't need to do anything ourselves. Diffusion of responsibility occurs when we assume that others will take action and therefore we do not take action ourselves. The irony is that people are more likely to help when they are the only ones in a situation than when others are around. You may have noticed diffusion of responsibility if you participated in an internet platform where people asked questions of other users. Did you find it was easier to get help if you directed your request to a smaller set of users than when you directed it to a larger number of people? Researchers found that people received help more quickly in about 37 seconds when they asked for help by specifying a participant's name than when no one was named at all, which took 51 seconds. The final step in the helping model is knowing how to help. For many of us, the ways to best help another person in an emergency are not that clear. Maybe we're not professionals, and we might not have any training in how to help in emergencies. People who have training in how to act in emergencies are more likely to help, whereas the rest of us just don't know what to do, so we may simply walk by. But today, since many people have cell phones, we can do a lot with a quick call. In fact, a phone call that night made at an earlier time might have saved Kitty Genovese's life.